We're starting this morning with a poem by Rumi, a great Indian poet, called The Guest House. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice. Meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond.
Do you want to open the Wonderbox for me today? What's in there? You gonna pull it out? Do you know that character? Sadness. Anybody recognize sadness from Inside Out? Yeah, that's a really big feeling, isn't it? And are all of us sad sometimes in our life? Yes. And so a really important thing I want to share with folks today is you don't have to show up happy and joyful all the time. You can show up even when you're sad, even when you're feeling a little overwhelmed, when there might be suffering going on in your life or grief. And those are really big. When is a time you might feel suffering? Right, you might have like immense heartbreak when someone or an animal in your house passes away. You might also have a lot of grief, and it can feel like big rocks that you're carrying. And an interesting thing I was sharing with Nick this week was how sometimes your body remembers, even when your mind forgets. And so while I had daughters' birthdays to celebrate and things last week, I was a little grumpy. I was a little curmudgeon-y. I was a little just, and just not feeling it on some days. And I went, oh, it was almost exactly 4 years to the day when the pandemic had started. And my body remembered that score. And so sometimes, even as we move through stages of grief and through things, our body might remember, and our body might be trying to tell us to come back and sit with it, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's hard. And it's important to kind of listen to your body and feel that and notice it and not be in a rush to just, oh, that's icky and I want to move through it, and just kind of sit there. So I thought today we might, instead of sharing a story, do a little bit of a body scan. So I invite people to participate as you wish. You may feel comfortable closing your eyes. And I'm just going to lead you through some places to think about in your body. So let's start at the very top with our head. Is your head, sometimes your hair can even feel tight, or your head can feel squeezed and sore. I want you to relax your brow. You might even sweep your fingers across it. I want you to tap your fingers on your head gently. Open your mind to all the possibilities. Take a good breath in. Feel your chest rise and fall. Maybe even gently your ears. Can you hear things around you? Let's be quiet for just a second. Feeling that stillness. A big place I carry it is in my jaw. Can you loosen your jaw? Maybe even stick your tongue out. Let's move down our neck. Are your shoulders up at your ears? If they are, gently let them down. Move your neck a little. Move those shoulders closer to the ground. Breathe again. Is there nervousness in your fingers, in your hands? Are your fists clenched? Think about unrolling each and every finger. Sometimes I'll trace my finger. Sometimes I'll just pull and slide my fingers against my fingers. Let go. Be present with it. Oh, how about your chest? Is it tight? Open it up. Open your hands up. Because you do not have to suffer alone. You are in community. How about in your waist, in your seat? Wiggle your bottom a little. Let that go. Roll your hips. Imagine your fingers moving down your legs. Maybe your feet want you to run. Maybe your toes are curled. Uncurl every single toe. Try to find grounding here in the space. Now I want you to imagine from the very tips of your toes all the way up to your head that there's a nice little balloon that is pulling you gently up. Feel your posture change, your shoulders change, and a nice breath in and out. And as you're ready, gently open your eyes and come back into the space. And with that, I hope you will scan your body and check and see what's going on for you at any point throughout the service, throughout the day, throughout the week. And we are going to sing the children out to our classes.
Hello again. Just a minute. One of the sorrows of life. I woke up at 5 a.m. on Thursday morning, past Thursday, startled by a dream. In this dream, my spouse, Nancy, and I had been living in an apartment complex with many others and had just been told that bulldozers would be coming immediately to raise the apartments on our block. We would be assigned another space to live, but all of our possessions that had not been removed already would disappear under the rubble of a wrecking ball. I realized there was no time to grab even necessary medications, as we were immediately ushered out of the building into a line waiting to be processed. It was becoming dustier and noisier moment by moment as the huge machines began their work. And as I shuffled along, I realized that Nancy and I had been separated in the confusion. Gone, gone. A Buddhist might say, gate, gate. Gone, gone. Gone all possessions. Gone all sense of connectedness and safety. Gone in a moment. Everything I'd been living with, carrying with me from place to place for decades was gone. I'd been forcibly displaced, and we'd be starting from scratch. But why that dream? Why on that morning? I know recently, and for the past few years, been deeply touched by stories of displacement from all over the world, even as close as Indianapolis, as we who went on a little tour a year ago saw. Also, I've been thinking about different forms of suffering since last Tuesday when Nick called and asked if I'd share a brief reflection on suffering from the Buddhist perspective for this Sunday. That caused some suffering right then. And furthermore, I've been revising my will. A lot has changed since the amazing 14 years since I made the last one. I couldn't believe that. And it's time to pay attention to my end-of-life realities. All of these factors bring me daily to the experience of Buddhist view of suffering. I've thought a lot about this since starting on the Buddhist path 30 years ago, when I heard that the first noble truth was that suffering exists and that everyone suffers. People get sick, old, and die. We hold tightly to things, and in that grasping, we suffer. Or we try to avoid suffering, and in that aversion, we suffer. The list is endless. Losing one's job can be suffering. Perhaps keeping the job you have is suffering. Feeling disrespected is suffering. Disrespecting others is suffering. Anxiety can be suffering. Irritation is suffering. Knowing that one day we're going to die and lose everything can be suffering. Startling dreams can cause suffering, and on and on. If all of us worked together on our list, we would have an amazing number of ways that when we think about it, we suffer. My relatively small experiences of suffering have certainly taken on an infinite variety of forms. My Buddhist practice helps me recognize some of these. The practices, some of these practices of reading about Buddhism, being part of a sangha or community, daily sitting meditation for even a few minutes, all help me slow down enough so clarity can appear. And then if I can stay still long enough, difficult, I can let this recognition do its work inside me. After years of Buddhist practice, sometimes I find I can stay with this new clarity and its accompanying feelings long enough to allow for healing to happen and equanimity to emerge. When I can allow equanimity to find its calm, solid space within me, compassion can show up and maybe move me to action. For instance, I'm often surprised to find that this or that person no longer irritates me. And I'm surprised by that. What happened? Or I can just allow that wild driver to have his or her bad day and not react. Or I can fully enjoy our house and yard, realizing that one day, probably sooner rather than later, they're going to be someone else's to enjoy, and I can hold them lightly and let them go. I can be touched by and hopefully move toward some small act of compassion towards another. Norman Fisher, who is a Jewish rabbi and Zen teacher in California, writes in his book, "When You Greet Me, I Bow." It's his latest book. He says, quote, "In difficult times, the key thing is to turn toward the suffering instead of trying to figure out how to get rid of it or papering it over with all kinds of positive things. We need to learn how to turn toward suffering, really take it in, find the meaning in it, and let it open a path for us to a new life. There's nothing more beneficial than being able to be present with the breath and with the body to what's happening when we are suffering without flailing around in resistance. That's the beginning of a new path," end quote. That new path can be richer, fuller life, where we can bring all of who we are, the suffering and the joy, into our relationships and into our world. May we all become more and more skilled at welcoming whatever appears at our door, as Ruby says, and find joy also on our emerging paths. Thank you. This is a reading from an excerpt from the book No Mud, No Lotus, The Art of Transforming Suffering by Thich Nhat Hanh, the Zen Buddhist Vietnamese monk. In each of our Plum Village practice centers around the world, we have a lotus pond. Everyone knows we need to have mud for lotuses to grow. The mud doesn't smell so good, but the lotus flower smells very good. If you don't have mud, the lotus won't manifest. You can't grow lotus flowers on marble. Without mud, there can be no lotus. It is possible, of course, to get stuck in the mud of life. It's easy enough to notice mud all over you all the time. The hardest thing to practice is not allowing yourself to be overwhelmed by despair. When you're overwhelmed by despair, all you can see is suffering everywhere you look. When you first hear that suffering is a noble truth, you might wonder what's so noble about suffering. The Buddha was saying that if we can recognize suffering and if we embrace it and look deeply into its roots, then we'll be able to let go of the habits that feed it and at the same time find a way to happiness. Suffering has its beneficial aspects. It can be an excellent teacher.
Our second reading is from a poem or a prayer, from Black Liturgy's Prayers, Poems, and Meditations for Staying Human by Cole Arthur Riley. This is an excerpt from a prayer, which is a prayer for those who have forgotten how to cry. God of the unmoved, move our spirits. Whether out of trauma or pride, some of us have left our emotions in our past or have turned against them altogether. We feel safer in our stoicism, protected from looking the fool, from the risk of doubling the pain by recognizing it. Remind us of the beauty and necessity in our tears. Bring into focus our child selves that wailed without shame. Remind us that our need is not a nuance. We've grown calloused from the overwhelming helplessness of mass information. Call us back into a wholeness and nuance that honor the dignity of the world with mourning. Soften our hearts to tragedy, even our own. Bring us into proximity with the wisely vulnerable, that they may teach us true courage, and give us aid in our anguish to journey with us in and out of sorrow. Grant us ears to hear our own grief and to welcome it into our body as a friend once lost, found again. Amen. Throughout my life, I have come to believe that I connect most with individuals through our shared expressions of our common humanity. In those moments, you know them, you've felt them, when we remember that we are human and we are willing to be seen as human in the face of another, the connection feels more alive, it feels stronger and more lasting. The intensity of connection, of being seen for what we truly are, each of us a spark of the divine, is hard to sustain for a very long period of time. It's like a staring contest. Eventually, we all need to blink. And that's all right. That's appropriate. It's how the eye works and it's how the heart works as well. We need both the ordinary and the extraordinary, the active and the passive, the joy as well as the sorrow. This last dynamic, joy and sorrow, is one we lift up every Sunday, as we did today. We have a ritual of joys and sorrows, and it offers us space to hold both within each of us, within this community, and throughout the world. By doing this ritual, we strengthen our capacity to look without blinking, to connect on a deeper level, a level where our humanity is seen, held, and cherished. And I bet that each of you, excuse me, I'm sorry. And I bet that each of you feel differently about this time of the service. You might individually feel different on any given Sunday, depending on the week or morning you are having. For some, this ritual might feel too vulnerable or awkward. For others of you, it might just be the connection you need to know you are not alone in your sadness or your joy. For some, it might feel beautiful and a container for our humanity. For others, it might feel forced or unpredictable. And all of these feelings are fine. They are your feelings, and we must acknowledge our feelings when we have them. It's funny, this ritual is somewhat controversial throughout Unitarian Universalist congregations across the country. Some congregations have it, some don't. It's often viewed as more common in smaller congregations and/or congregations that have been founded more recently, like in the last 75 years, and/or congregations outside of Boston. Well, we are all three of those. A relatively young, smaller congregation out here in the heartland of the United States, where the Midwest meets the South. Historically, this ritual was introduced by female ministers and lay leaders who, let's be honest, introduced much of the most common current elements of what we have become accustomed to participating in during Sunday morning services today. During the Vietnam War, many congregations changed the language from joys and sorrows to joys and concerns. There were many issues in the world and our nation at that time that were of great concern. But concern and sorrow likely have a different emotional response, one you might gravitate more than the other, and that's okay. I wonder if the term joys and sorrows will ever change again. The youth shared a few weeks ago something that really resonated with some, this dynamic of sweet and sour. I've also heard roses and thorns, not bad. Well, in light of our topic today, I want to try another one on for size. What if we called it, let's go with me on this. What if we called it happiness and suffering? You know, it has a ring to it. We'd say, I'd like to light a candle for the happiness I'm experiencing because of X, Y, or Z. Or on the other hand, I'd say, I'd like to light a candle for the suffering I'm feeling because of X, Y, or Z. Okay, so some of you might not be into that, which is okay. Let me guess, happiness feels right. That feels appropriate, kind of a synonym for joy. We live in a nation that declares it even a right in that pursuit of it, of happiness. But suffering, on the other hand, you might be thinking, whoa, Nelly, pump the brakes here. I'm not so sure if that's a synonym for sorrow that I want to jump on board with. And I agree, it is a bit different. Suffering is not on the bingo card for most Unitarian Universalists. Indeed, as I've said before, Unitarian Universalism historically focuses less on suffering, despair, and death compared to happiness, hope, and life. That's our strong suit. But no matter how much our optimistic, liberal religious worldview persists, it is impossible to deny the awakening that is unfolding within the collective consciousness and conscience of the world, and likewise within Unitarian Universalism. An awakening that is calling us toward greater awareness of all levels of suffering and how that suffering relates to our pursuit of collective liberation. So death aside for a moment, because truly that occurrence typically only happens once for each of us. How might we approach suffering in a meaningful way? Well, we can begin by turning to the creme de la creme of religions that articulate the reality of an antidote for suffering, that is, Buddhism. In particular, I'd like for us to explore the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, who was one of the most recognized Buddhists in the Western world and remained so even after his death a couple years ago. As the founder of what is called engaged Buddhism, a more socially conscious form of Buddhism, he articulated 14 precepts for this approach to life. And if you read them overlaid by Unitarian Universalist principles, it's ridiculous, ridiculously cool. The fourth precept has to do with suffering, which is worded this way, quote, "Do not avoid suffering or close your eyes before suffering. Do not lose awareness of the existence of suffering in the life or the world. Find ways to be with those who are suffering, including personal contact, visits, images, and sounds. By such means, awaken yourself and others to the reality of suffering in the world." Thich Nhat Hanh, engaged Buddhism, and Buddhism in general invite us to awaken to the reality of suffering in the world. The original and continued foundation of Buddhism, articulated by the Buddha himself thousands of years ago, acknowledged not only that suffering is real, but that suffering is not the totality of human experience. Thich Nhat Hanh summarizes what are referred to as the Four Noble Truths as, quote, 1, there is suffering. 2, there is a course of action that generates suffering. 3, suffering ceases, that is, there is happiness. And 4, there is a course of action leading to the cessation of suffering. In other words, the arising of happiness, end quote. Thich Nhat Hanh describes suffering and happiness, for that matter, through a visceral and memorable metaphor of the lotus flower. Perhaps one of the most beautiful flowers in the world, the lotus is symbolic of purity, rebirth, and divinity, among many other things, and holds a lot of importance for Buddhists and Hindus, among many other people and religions. Thich Nhat Hanh speaks to the way the lotus is a metaphor for suffering. Quote, "Everyone knows we need to have mud for lotuses to grow. The mud doesn't smell so good, but the lotus smells really good. If you don't have mud, the lotus won't manifest. You can't grow flowers on marble. Without mud, there can be no lotus. We must remember that suffering is a kind of mud that we need in order to generate joy and happiness. Without suffering, there is no happiness. So we shouldn't discriminate against the mud. We have to learn how to embrace and cradle our own suffering and the suffering of the world with a lot of tenderness." End quote. Now, in the Western world where we live, especially through the dominance of Christianity, many of us have come to see suffering as a form of punishment for something we have personally done or that is due to our inherent original sin as human beings. Spoiler, Unitarian Universalism does not support such narrow and cruel understandings of the human experience, nor of an abusive God teaching such lessons. Rather, like Thich Nhat Hanh, we are taught that suffering happens when we are dislocated, disassociated, disconnected from our shared humanity and the goodness of our interdependence with all of life. Suffering happens when we close our eyes, not to blink, not to rehydrate them, but to turn away from the truth of our collective goodness, beauty, and divinity. So some of us, perhaps more than others in this room or watching online at home, have different appreciation for suffering. As mentioned earlier, with our ritual of joys and sorrows, some would like to stick to the positive, the good, the happiness, truly the lotus, and others would like for us to not forget, indeed beg us, to not close our eyes to the suffering, the sorrow, the death, and the mud of life, near and far, the mud within, among, and beyond us this day. And again, neither is right nor wrong. Your feelings matter, and at the same time, as our Wonderbox time this morning articulated, it's good to be in touch with where we're feeling that suffering, that pain. It's important to understand when we might be in mud, stuck in a mud patch, perhaps, but it will likely, before we know it, be time to go. Not like time to go, like the ultimate time to go, but more like the time to go, as in we are creatures of movement. And it is rare for any of us to remain indefinitely in either nirvana or a bog for long. In other words, as you may be more familiar in this part of the world, in other words, as you may be more familiar in this part of the world, we might remember that this too shall pass. Now, let me be clear, suffering and happiness occur not passively, like waiting for the sun or moon to rise in the sky, but rather they require active cultivation, like a gardener getting down into the mud to make way for that lotus to emerge. The sayings, no mud, no lotus, or this too shall pass, is not an invitation to get stuck in the mud or to allow others to stay stuck in the mud, nor are these cyclical patterns of or justification for seeing suffering as good, or at least ambivalent. Suffering is not good. Just because Thich Nhat Hanh may see suffering as being a good teacher doesn't mean that we deserve the pain of suffering, nor that there is nobility in suffering. Indeed, the more we are aware of suffering, the more we can remain in touch with not only the suffering throughout the world, but that is within our own hearts. And this recognition, from this recognition, the eyes wide open practice of day-to-day life, blinking only when necessary, can then motivate us in our continued peacemaking work and our bridge building work, in our celebration of love and our continued work for justice. We need not pick sides, suffering, happiness, joys, sorrows, atheist, theist, all the other binary things we seem to feel like we've been asked to pick sides, gender, sexuality, go on. We experience both joy and sorrow, happiness and suffering. We are beautifully hybrid and complex. Said differently, in the words of Walt Whitman in his poem Song for Myself, do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large. I am filled with multitudes. My friends, that is it. We contain multitudes and are able to move between these large and curving parts of ourselves. Yes, we are able to approach the mud, to bow towards it and lift the lotus from its hands, an offering for our day, our week, our life. Yes, as Cole Arthur Riley prays, we need not be unmoved. We can work through our trauma and our pride, putting aside our stoicism and our callousness, and come into greater proximity with the wisely vulnerable, who know deep down the courage that we will need on our journeys ahead. Yes, my friends, in our movement, we may come to hear once more the grief of our own hearts, the suffering of our world that we share, and reopen the doors to this guest house. Reopen those doors to this guest house that is our bodies and this community and this world, to a friend, welcoming them in once more, once lost, found again. Let us open that door. May it be so, and amen.